At just 73 meters below the surface, a 29,000-ton steel ship is disappearing faster than wrecks buried in the deepest parts of the ocean. Not because the environment is harsher, but because it is more active. Everything about the ocean suggests depth should preserve. Cold slows reactions. Darkness limits life. Shipwrecks at 4,000 meters have survived for over a century, but the Andrea Doria is doing the opposite. Her hull is collapsing. Her decks are folding inward. Divers returning decades later describe not gradual decay, but structural loss, entire sections gone. Only decades ago, this was a functioning ocean liner, resting off Nantucket after sinking in 1956. What is happening now has little to do with the collision that sank her. This is not a story about a shipwreck. This is a story about what the ocean actually is, a system that does not preserve structure, but turns it into process. Most people think of the ocean as a location, a destination, a grave. That framing is wrong, and it is exactly why the Andrea Doria's disappearance seems like a paradox instead of an inevitability. The ocean is a planetary engine. It moves energy, oxygen, heat, and nutrients across 361 million square kilometers of surface and 1.335 billion cubic kilometers of volume. It has been running this engine continuously for roughly 3.5 billion years. It does not pause for shipwrecks. It does not preserve history as a courtesy. It does what it has always done. It takes structure and turns it into process. This is the concept that unlocks everything that follows. The ocean does not destroy the Andrea Doria the way we imagine destruction violently, suddenly, from the outside in. It does something far more systematic. It absorbs her. It incorporates her mass into flows that were already moving before the ship was built, before Italy existed, before the Atlantic Ocean took its current shape. The 29,000 tons of steel sitting at 73 meters off Nantucket are not resting, they are reacting. And the system doing that to them has been operating on a planetary scale since before multicellular life evolved. At 73 meters, the Andrea Doria sits inside one of the most energetically active zones of that system, the mesopelagic boundary, where sunlight still reaches in faint traces, where temperatures shift seasonally between 4 and 15 degrees Celsius, and where current systems driven by tides, wind, and density gradients remain in continuous motion. She is not on the edge of the ocean's influence. She is inside its engine room. The primary driver of her destruction is oxygen, and at 73 meters in the North Atlantic, dissolved oxygen is abundant, typically ranging between 6 and 8 milligrams per liter, constantly replenished by surface mixing and regional circulation. This matters because oxygen is what initiates steel's transformation. When iron alloys are exposed to oxygen-rich seawater, electrochemical corrosion begins within hours. Iron atoms lose electrons and migrate into solution, forming iron oxides and hydroxides. But in seawater, this is not a clean chemical process. Chloride ions present at concentrations of roughly 19 grams per liter in the Atlantic penetrate the oxide layer and accelerate ion exchange directly at the metal surface. The chemistry alone would be damaging enough, but the biology is what makes it relentless. Within weeks of the sinking, sulfate-reducing bacteria and iron-oxidizing microorganisms colonized every exposed surface of the hull. These organisms do not simply live on the metal. They feed on the electrochemical conditions that destroy it. They consume iron compounds, excrete acids, and form dense biofilm communities that create localized corrosion cells directly at the metal surface. Microbiologically influenced corrosion can increase degradation rates by a factor of 10 compared to purely chemical processes. At first glance, you might expect biology to slow the ship's decay life, building structure, life stabilizing the wreck, but the opposite is happening. The biology here is not building, it is processing. It is the ocean's most efficient tool for returning steel to its component elements. Temperature determines how fast this processing runs. And this is where the Andrea Doria's depth becomes her sentence rather than her salvation. In the deep ocean, water near 2 degrees Celsius slows enzyme activity, suppresses microbial reproduction, and limits the kinetic energy available for chemical reactions. Corrosion still happens in the deep, but slowly, constrained by thermodynamics. The Andrea Doria does not have that constraint. The waters surrounding her fluctuate between 4 degrees Celsius in winter and up to 15 degrees in late summer. That range sits precisely within the optimal zone for the microbial communities driving her destruction. There is no cold season pause. Enzyme function is sustained year-round. Metabolic cycles continue without interruption. Compare this directly to the Titanic, resting at 3,800 meters in near-freezing water. Her decay is real and ongoing. Iron-eating bacteria have formed distinctive rustical formations across her hull, but it is fundamentally throttled by the energy available at that depth. The Andrea Doria operates in a thermodynamic environment where energy is not the limiting factor. Oxygen is abundant. Temperature supports full biological activity. Currents deliver fresh reactants continuously. Every variable that drives transformation is available and active. The system is not running slow. It is running at capacity. From the outside, the wreck is subjected to mechanical forces that compound everything happening at the chemical and biological level. Currents running across the hull at speeds between 0.5 and 2 knots generate continuous shear stress against surfaces already weakened by corrosion. When rust forms and begins to stabilize, the next current pulse strips the layer away before it can provide any protective function. This is flow-accelerated corrosion, and it means the ship never accumulates the benefit of its own decay products, acting as a barrier. The ship's geometry makes this asymmetric. The Andrea Doria rests at a 20-degree starboard list, a permanent tilt that alters how every current interacts with her. The port side faces stronger flow, higher shear stress, and faster material removal. The starboard side falls into a partial wake zone where particle deposition is greater and burial is progressive. One side is being scoured, the other is being buried. Both processes weaken structural integrity through entirely different mechanisms operating simultaneously, on the same ship, at the same depth. At first glance, you might think the buried side is protected sediment as insulation, stillness as preservation, but the opposite is happening there too. Sediment burial reduces oxygen exchange, accelerates anaerobic microbial activity, and creates exactly the conditions for the most structurally damaging form of corrosion the ship faces. Inside the wreck, the system diverges into something more complex and more destructive. As seawater enters enclosed compartments, staterooms, cargo holds, engine spaces flow, velocity drops, and mixing decreases sharply. Oxygen is consumed by microbial activity faster than limited circulation can replenish it. These spaces transition from open, high-energy environments into semi-closed microenvironments with fundamentally different chemistry-isolated zones, governed by entirely different rules than the oceans surrounding them. Dissolved oxygen in some interior spaces falls below 2 milligrams per liter. Below that threshold, aerobic communities cannot sustain themselves. Sulfate-reducing bacteria take over. They consume sulfate ions dissolved in seawater and produce hydrogen sulfide as a metabolic byproduct. Hydrogen sulfide reacts with iron to form iron sulfide compounds, structurally unstable, highly porous, and mechanically fragile. The metal does not simply thin. Its crystalline structure is compromised from within. It becomes brittle before it becomes thin. This means the Andrea Doria is not decaying along one pathway. She is being processed along at least 2 parallel pathways simultaneously: oxidative corrosion on the exterior, sulfide transformation in the interior, each driven by its own microbial community, each producing a different form of structural failure, each invisible to the other but operating on the same steel at the same time. Divers who have penetrated the interior since the 1980s have documented this divergence directly. In the early years after the sinking, passages were navigable, dangerous, but passable. By the mid-2000s, entire corridor sections had become impassable, not because of sedimentation or debris accumulation, but because overhead structures had deformed under altered load paths. The ship's 2-0 degree list means the structural logic built into her original design no longer functions as intended. Weight that was engineered to travel vertically through frames and bulkheads now transfers laterally. Connections designed for vertical load experience shear forces they were never meant to carry. As corrosion concentrates at exactly those points where unintended forces are highest, failure propagates. One section collapses. The load it was carrying transfers to an adjacent section already weakened by the same process. That section fails next. Structural engineers call this progressive collapse. The Andrea Doria is experiencing it in slow motion, driven by the intersection of biology, chemistry, asymmetric geometry, and a planetary system that does not negotiate. At least 22 divers have died attempting to explore this wreck since 1956. She is widely considered the most dangerous recreational dive site in the world, not because of depth alone, but because of what the system has done to her interior geometry. She demands everything. She gives nothing back easily. There is a human dimension to this that deserves to be spoken directly. The Andrea Doria was not just a ship. She was the pride of post-war Italy, a national statement, built to show the world that a country devastated by war had rebuilt itself into something beautiful. Her interiors carried original artworks commissioned specifically for the voyage. Murals by Salvatore Fiume, ceramic panels by Piero Fornasetti, a 20-meter mosaic in the first-class dining room. A floating museum of Italian modernism welded into a hull and sent across the Atlantic to carry 1,200 passengers in the finest ocean liner her nation had ever built. All of that is still down there, or what the system has left of it. The artworks have not survived intact. Seawater, pressure cycling, biological colonization, and sediment have processed them the same way they are processing the steel. The ocean does not make exceptions for human significance. It does not recognize the difference between a hull plate and a mosaic. Both are material, both are substrate, both are inputs to the same process. This is not cruelty, it is consistency. The same system that is dissolving the Andrea Doria built the conditions for every living thing on this planet. It is not indifferent to human history. It simply operates at a scale where human history is not a meaningful category. The paradox that opened this story resolves here, and what it resolves into is larger than a single shipwreck. The Andrea Doria is disappearing faster than ships in the deep ocean, not because this environment is harsher in the way we typically use that word. She is disappearing faster because this zone is more alive, more oxygen, more current energy, more biological activity, more thermal variability, more mechanical input. Every variable that drives transformation is amplified at 73 meters in the North Atlantic. The deep ocean preserves because it is slow. This depth processes because it is fast. This ship is not rusting. It is being consumed by a living system that has been performing this function since before animals existed on land. The ocean does not destroy things the way we imagine. It takes structure and turns it into process. It takes the specific, a hull plate, a mosaic, a stateroom, a name, and returns it to the general flow that has been moving energy and mass across the planet for billions of years. What looks like destruction from the inside of human time is, at planetary scale, simply circulation. The ocean is not erasing the Andrea Doria, it is incorporating her. Every atom of iron in that hull was iron before it was a ship. It will be iron again somewhere else, in another form, part of another system. The ocean does not lose material, it moves it. The Andrea Doria will be unrecognizable within decades. Researchers estimate full structural collapse within 20 to 30 years. What will remain is a scatter of corroded metal across the seafloor, a permanent alteration of local sediment chemistry, A reef community built on what was once a ship, and the faint chemical signature of 29,000 tons of steel being slowly returned to the water column. She is not being lost, she is being returned. And what this story leaves you with, if you let it, is a different understanding of what the ocean is. Not a graveyard, not a museum, not a place where history is stored in cold and darkness. The ocean is a processor. It has been running continuously for longer than our planet has had continents in their current arrangement. It will be running long after the last trace of the Andrea Doria has dissolved into the Atlantic. The specific becomes general, structure becomes flow, a ship becomes chemistry, and the system moves on, carrying what was once the most beautiful ocean liner in the world distributed invisibly across the sea. If you want to understand how the ocean processes not just ships, but time itself, subscribe. There is more where this came from.